Welcome, everyone, to our latest edition of the Pari Center's Book a Month Club, entitled Choosing My Goethe. R. Safranski's Goethe, Life is a Work of Art, and A.N. Wilson's Goethe, A Faustian Life, with Alison Liebling. Alison Liebling is a professor of criminology and criminal justice at the University of Cambridge and the director of the Institute of Criminology's Prisons Research Center. She has carried out research on life in prisons for over 30 years. Her projects have included suicide and self-harm in prisons, close supervision centers for difficult prisoners, incentives and earned privileges, staff-prisoner relationships, the location and building of trust in high-security prisons. She has just completed a Leverhulme Major Research Fellowship carrying out the project Moral Rule Science and Forms of Order in Prison. She is finishing a book arising from that project, tentatively called Aristotle's Prison, A Search for Humanity and Justice. She argues that what keeps people alive in prison is feeling part of a moral universe. And I will now hand our conversation over to Alison. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Michael. And thank you, Eleanor and Michael, for this invitation to host this edition of the Book a Month Club. Thank you all for coming. I've landed myself in a bit of trouble choosing two large books instead of one small one. I'm also no expert on Goethe, although he's been present in the background of my writing life directly and indirectly since I studied English literature at school and as a subsidiary subject at university. So my observations today, especially on these two masterworks, are tentative, but hopefully interesting enough to stimulate discussion. I tried to read The Sorrows of Young Werther when I was studying suicides in prison. That was my PhD subject, but I couldn't bear to finish it then. I've finished it more recently, amongst others of his works, for reasons that I hope will become obvious. So my deep love affair with Goethe started in earnest more recently when I came across the term delicate empiricism several years ago, and when I detected the presence of his work in the work of George Eliot, who was my first literary love. And she, of course, is the translator of Spinoza's Ethics and much besides. And I returned to George Eliot 9 years ago in a series of coincidences that have enabled me to make sense of my professional lifetime in prisons research. Her descriptions of human vibrations and moral experience have helped me to propose the operation of a kind of moral grammar in the universe, detectable with some clarity, but not with ease, in prisons because of their emotional intensity and due to the absence and then fleeting presence of values we all need inside them. So I've been able to describe this presence and absence in detail and untangle their effects. The absence of human virtues is one of the main explanations for suicides in prison, for example, and I'll come back to this later. So in Goethe's term, delicate empiricism, I felt I'd found a concept that helped describe my approach to social science research in prisons, something I was writing a chapter about. I completely recognized his methodology, and I'd used the same language. So attentive waiting, immersion in the whole, glimpsed in the one, the role of imaginative perception, and respect for the object of knowledge. Delicate empiricism was a participatory, morally responsible, and holistic approach to the description of dynamic life-world phenomena. So the world unfolds itself if we're patient and systematic. The more I read of him, the more I fell in love with this charismatic and fallible genius, prolific author, attentive scientist, and lover of what is alive. There were two hooks into my soul: Goethe's account of observation, so his conviction that truth emerges from life or experience, and his notion of human vitality seeking expression. My encounters in Pari fueled the flames, and particularly Jonathan Code's Goethean-inspired workshop last year on the ways in which we might place ourselves with devotion in relation to the natural world. When we attend lovingly to a plant, we want to know how it grows. The right questions to ask emerge from the world as it is. This was exactly my orientation to prisons research, but it was not always easy to defend. Goethe went to Italy, by the way, where he found humanity, beauty, warmth, joy, and life for its own sake, if not industriousness, to reinvent himself. And I'm about to spend my third period of time in Pari, during what I feel to be the most creative and intellectually alive period of my life. This alive period was made possible by a Leverhulme Major Research Fellowship, which I held for 3 years from 2000 to 2023. And it's this fellowship that's enabled me to pause from an exceptionally intense day job. It felt a bit like administering Weimar, for those of you who've read these books, to write a book. And as Michael said, the book is called Aristotle's Prison, A Search for Humanity and Justice. I've promised to submit it this summer, so that's my hope. Writing the book and encountering Pari and working out what I love in, if not about Goethe, are all changing my life. Something is being synthesized inside me. Some difficult questions, like where we place human and nature's darkness in our moral understanding, remain incompletely resolved. So to these two books in particular, when I emerged from Topping & Co.'s independent bookshop in Bath in October 2024, carrying these two great biographies under my arm, I felt more fully alive than I had when I entered. I was in Bath visiting a friend whose own book on the architecture of hope had just been published. My friend had appeared at the Cheltenham Book Festival the day before, and I'd gone along to share the occasion, and now she was introducing me to her new home in Bath and to the bookshops. Something drew me to the right shelf. The shop, I discovered later, sees itself as a world-opening, face-to-face, carefully curated book sanctuary that might help readers to find themselves in books. That description, which is on its website and in an interview with its owner, felt completely right. It's a stunning building that speaks, like Alberto Mangel, of literary wonder. I'm hoping Todd might appear tonight and introduce us to the library angel later. I've always been in awe of books. Writing one, honouring one written by a friend, and then finding two that called to me in a place of beauty that weekend made me feel ecstatic and somehow sure of my ground. That's not how I normally feel. Goethe might say that some truth emerged from my practice of or trust in life. I was both lost in its mystery and found in the feeling of the connectedness of everything. Reading these two books in succession illustrates Goethe's point. It's also my point now, and it's been made by others, that the natural experience of interconnection lies at the heart of our metamorphosis. We become who we are in an environment of other people. In Safranski's book, Goethe becomes a vivid, compelling work of art, a mighty tree, a force of nature, unifying the powers of art, science, literature, and philosophy in the interests of truth and life against trade and utility. Goethe, the individual, is a sort of medium for the world, who declares that we get closest to nature when we trust our own nature. We're stifled by consumption, ambition, speed, but also reason and monotony. We must always preserve and enhance life. So he's driven by eros, a mostly life-affirming force. His soul is a restless firework. He's colourful and creative. A.N. Wilson's Goethe, on the other hand, is a controlled alcoholic, a more odious figure with a monstrous ego and elements of malevolence. He tries to love life. He's more fallen. His Goethe shares signs of the character defects more overtly on destructive display in the figure of his son. There's no literary finessing of the life drama of the genius here. I found Wilson's book to be more painful and challenging, as if the scales were being made to fall from my eyes, having just read a more romantic version. Wilson does not collude with the idea of forbidden truths. He reveals Goethe in all his excess and debauchery, but also his genius. Something's asking me about, what language I'm speaking in. But anyway, so back to A.N. Wilson's book, two of his most powerful passages are as follows. First, Goethe's rapture as he reaches the summit of Brocken Mountain. He's stirred by the clear moonlight, and he addresses the mountain in poetry. He says, "You stand, your bosom unexplored, mysteriously revealed over the astonished world. You gaze out of the clouds as it realms, and their riches, which out of the veins of your brother mountains is watered from the rocks around you." Wilson goes on, personal self-doubt and pain, scientific interest in what the mountains contain, a sense of destiny mysteriously manifesting itself in the mountain scene, as when Wordsworth, after a night's dancing, walked home through the hill country of his Cumberland boyhood and was visited by a strange sense. My heart was full. I made now vows, but vows were then made for me. So we see how a once dreaded mountaintop, once reached, could only be described in the language of religion. We're most found when we're lost in wonder at the world and life itself. Only a few pages later, we read of Goethe's callousness as he advocates that a young woman, Johanna Hohn, an unmarried servant who killed her baby, should, after all, be executed. Karl August, the Duke, was hesitant. Young poor women were at the mercy of their class and their employers. Here, Goethe is Faust, detached, exploitative, and leaving Gretchen to her fate. These are the two souls struggling for mastery in Faust's breast. In an unusual translation of Faust, one writer suggests the line, "Life is not light, but refracted colour," and some of its colours are dark. The dark and chaotic part of Goethe is given life in Faust and in Wilson's biography. Of course, these two biographies have different authors and intentions. Rüdiger Safranski is a German literary scholar and philosopher. Through Goethe's relationships with almost every intellectual figure of the period, he connects us to German cultural and political life in a thrilling recreation of a magnificent life. His intellectual friendship with Schiller, for example, was intimate and creative and beautifully portrayed. Schiller's interest and their differences enabled him to make more active and lively use of his abilities. So I found Safranski's book powerful and gripping. Goethe came utterly to life. I made many connections and I wanted to read more of him. Safranski, the author, remains almost invisible in the text, and I can find little about him in print. He's unselfed. This might be an artifact of language, but somehow I doubt it. So I've searched and can find very little. A.N. Wilson, on the other hand, is an English biographer, historian, novelist, and journalist. He writes a much darker account in a sometimes coarser language. His account is more theological, or I might properly say more religious, deeply learned, still riveting. He learned German in order to read Faust in the original and translate his verse, and his reverence for the work is pressed on us throughout. But his analysis is infused by a focus on the abuse of power, the monstrous elements in nature and the human soul. He distracts us with some contemporary preoccupations like suicide amongst the young, sexual abuse, and environmental destruction. Wilson published an autobiography, Confessions, A Life of Failed Promises, shortly before he wrote this biography. His own self-appraisal is damning. I came across a recent, long recorded interview in which he discusses his own school-age abuse and the anorexia that followed. The interview is quite moving and dark. I wonder if the author who loves Faust identifies with more of the darkness in it than Safranski does, or even than Goethe intended. His account of Goethe's relationship with young Fritz, the son of Charlotte von Stein, is quite harrowing. Both books are representations, and both have much to say about the importance of the human observer. I return mainly to Safranski for the links between Goethe's work and my own thinking, and I explore two main Goethe-inspired ideas, the role of the human observer and the concept of the life force. So in chapter 16, Safranski describes Goethe's relationship to nature and observation. He says, when we descend into the self, we lose our grounding. The granite we find in the earth, however, provides a foundation. So the granite brings peace and firmness in contrast to the fragile, changeable vagaries of the human heart. The world's substance returns us to ourselves. As Spinoza had argued, stability is achieved only by perceiving the unity that joins mind to all of nature. So the groundedness I felt when I emerged from that bookshop was related to the experience of the connectedness of all things. We find ourselves when we lose ourselves in the wholeness of life. Iris Murdoch, who was familiar with Goethe, makes a similar point in The Sovereignty of Good when she tells the tale of a kestrel distracting her from internal anguish, a form of unselfing that she makes the foundation of her moral philosophy. Goethe's version of observation is dynamic because being is dynamic, a constant becoming. When we observe, what we see is development, inner formative powers combining with forces from without. This is a universally animating principle, a sort of spiritualized naturalism visible in nature. Goethe argued that the foundations of truth lie in the careful study of natural history, perceiving the great chain of being to which we all belong. That we can see this using our own healthy senses means that these senses are the greatest and most precise physical apparatus there can be. We are our own research instruments. So many key ideas resonate with me here. That we're alive and that this has implications for our research methods, that we should be interested in the world and in ideas as living things, that we can observe the world using our own senses, and that to live means to grow. Nothing is ever static or isolated from the whole. All of these ideas found their way into my work before I read Goethe as a result of close observation. I've also detected retrospectively that all the writers I do read have read Goethe, or they seem to have him in common. Reading him now and others influenced by him has strengthened my case. So the book I'm writing draws on several research projects carried out over time in prisons, including work on suicides in prison, on violence, and on personal growth. And I'm mainly interested in differences between prisons, particularly in what I've come to call their moral climates. So I show how prisoners become expert witnesses on what it takes to survive and flourish, mainly humanity, respect, and fairness, or conversely, on the very precise ways in which disrespect, unfairness, distrust, and fear lead to despair, rage, and moral collapse. Ideas like humanity or justice live in prison. That's their only meaning. They take different shapes, they're experienced by prisoners, and they're accessible to the observer. After painstaking efforts, they become measurable, and there's an inner cohesion to their operation. So I've learned to measure this environment by paying close attention to it and by always staying in contact with genuine experience. This is precisely how Goethe's delicate empiricism is described. If we stay close to our subject, engage in more than one way, and use well-informed imagination, we can gain an understanding that reveals the life and vitality of the things we're studying. This is rather like I use a methodology called appreciative inquiry, which I've used to explore peak experiences. It's a creative methodology that helped me find out what matters most to staff and prisoners. It took me straight to what gives people life and vitality. And briefly put, what I found is that the moral environment in prisons, and I argue in our lives more generally, is a matter of life and death. When we put people in prison, we devastate the life force in general, but not always. My empirical work on suicides and suicide attempts in prison shows that we're more likely to opt for death, as Camus put it, in morally depriving environments in places where we don't matter, where we're treated with indifference and inhumanity. Where there's attention, presence, and humanity, we're more likely to survive. These findings provide some foundation for the case that we inhabit a moral universe and that our souls are aware of this. I show later that in some exceptional prisons, prisoners describe a kind of finding of life and self. They discover or form an I in what I now call I-thou prisons, and this I is more alive than the I in I-it relations, as Martin Buber put it. Prisoners describe exceptional I-thou prisons, where they feel treated as experiencing subjects, as oases. They use that word often. They describe more typical I-it prisons, where they feel treated as experienced objects, as deserts. It was striking to me that prisoners are so adamant in their language when they describe outstanding prisons. So they say things like, I've been out in the desert, I was starving and now I'm fed, or replicate this prison. These are prisons. The words they use are vivid. So what explains the emphatic tone and emotional depth of their accounts? A famine of the soul, as Rowan Williams put it, is contrasted with the nourishment that allows us to grow. They're being drawn into life. This process is observable and linked to moral growth, amongst many other things. So a reworking of the living concepts of attention, presence, and humanity help us think differently about the answer to the question of whether life is worth living. So I'm arguing that we humans are just like sensitive plants. Our light is the regard of others. If the leaf is the phenomenon of plant life, the thing that recurs in all the various plant forms, but takes variable shape, perhaps ethos, or something like ethos, is the of human life. Our relational environment always exists, but it takes variable forms. Its archetypes, if you like, can be either life-giving, as in I-thou relations, or life-extinguishing, when we're in I-it environments. One kind of environment brings light and growth, and the other creates fog, which leads to violence or the extinguishing of life via misunderstandings or failures of seeing. So, like Goethe, I'm interested in forms of order, the art of seeing, questions of truth, and whether anything is sacred. I've shown how in an exceptional prison, seeing justly might require ignoring certain things for now, but this is a really fine balancing act. According to Safranski, Goethe ignored things that he couldn't respond to productively. One of the longest and most painful chapters to write in my book, the chapter itself is called Aristotle's Prison, Excess, Deficit, and the Masterpiece of Penal Order. In it, I confront the realities of violence in prison and the trickiness of finding the right balance between values in tension. So just because power is corruptible doesn't mean we can create societies without it. Blind faith in our fellow humans is no good at all, but cynicism is utterly destructive. In prison, intelligent doubt and professional confidence are the markers of practical wisdom. Discernment and imagination, as well as action, are involved. Strangely, as I've been thinking about these two biographies, they could be said to veer just to each side of the pinhead that I'm trying to describe in prisons. Some critics find Safranski's account too sanitized. I found Wilson's account too brutal in places. We read biographies because we live with the living. Our search for the individual is connected to the strongest feeling of being. And I wonder if Safranski's unselfing and Wilson's present fragile self make two Goethes. And I also wonder what I might give up if I choose Safranski's. So I'm ending my comments with a sort of paradox that I can't quite grasp or question. I'll try and express it, but I don't know whether I've quite got it yet. But it's something to do with whether Goethe's spiritual naturalism is a more sustaining thing for the soul. It connects him to the idea that there is such a thing as the good, than the periodic waves of doubt felt by believers. So A.N. Wilson, I think, is a religious believer, but he experiences waves of doubt, and he describes religion's death throes in the face of growing materialism. And somehow Safranski may have a stronger sense of self, which he then keeps in the background. And this might be linked to his, I'm hypothesizing, less direct experience of violence and abuse. So he projects less onto, or identifies less directly with his subject, with the darker side of Faust or the darker side of Goethe. A.N. Wilson feels to me as if he's identifying much more strongly with the dark side of Faust. And I'm left wondering about this. I haven't made up my mind yet, but it's raised all sorts of questions in my mind about nature and violence in nature and spiritual naturalism, and the question of, because of my research subject, what comes after violence, and whether it's possible to make a kind of journey of the self from ignoring it and pretending it doesn't exist to seeing it everywhere, to some kind of sense that it exists and must be taken seriously, but without giving up on the possibility of good. And Goethe's study of nature seems to help us to get there, or something like that. Okay, I'll stop there. I hope what I've said has made sense. I'm talking about lots of different things, and I realize these books have a lot more in them than I've managed to extract, but I'm very much hoping that you will join in with the exploration now.
Thank you so much, Alison. Thank you. That was absolutely wonderful. And now we open it up to all of you. If you would like to participate, ask a question, comment on anything Alison has said, please do join the conversation. You can use the raise your hand function that you can find at the bottom of your screen under reactions. Or you can just physically raise your hand and I can call you out. So if you'd like to contribute anything to the conversation.
Hey, it's Todd.
Okay, Todd is unmuted. Oh, Alison, what a plate full of things to consider. Your analysis in your book, as you shared it in Pari, has so much behind it in what you have just said. Two different versions of seeing somebody named Goethe with all his humanity and all the humanity of those that are trying to analyze somebody with such humanity is beyond comprehension. In what you have synthesized needs a great deal of digestion further to go farther. You asked a question earlier about the library angel. My conclusions of the teleological way of being, Goethe being a part of that, all of us being not failed, but fallible elements of being, is that there is help along the line. There's a teleologic, you've come to a conclusion of a moral nature of the universe through some of the hardest places of being a human, prisons, which is an aspect of humanity few of us know. Seldom will any of us be there, but incomprehensible to all of us not having been there. But to come to the idea that just to quickly put in the library angel, that is the notion that there is an aid in this understanding of what it is to be, that you wandering to that particular bookstore went out with 2 tomes that have given you food for thought and how you are and how you see the world, and you're sharing that with the rest of the world now. That phenomenon is deeply related to all the stories of synchronicities, where there is some external, seemingly acausal moment that allows meaningful interaction in somebody's life. And the library angel goes from a book falling on somebody's head that didn't even know they were looking for it. They sent them down a path that then is next their engagement with life and being, to that which you went in, looked up, and these 2 volumes you walked out of the room with and went to digest and talk about now. So I will not talk any further, but it is the dynamic of being is what you're demonstrating there by those books and your engagement with 2 authors about one individual and what we are as individuals, and something that's far more than we can digest individually, but my gosh, it is moral. Thank you.
Thank you, Todd. Raymond, would you like to come in?
Hi, Eleanor. Yes, I certainly would. Alison, I thoroughly enjoyed your sharing of your story. And I was thinking at the time, you know, when you chose those two books, I thought to myself, and I just made a note of this, two books, quite clearly, yet one person choosing. And I often think of the twos or the pairs or the dualities that are seemingly external to ourselves. But then I think to myself, I've recently been studying the Kabbalah with the internal pairs, as it were. I think there are 5 pairs in total. And I think it's the most wonderful thing. I have been through tremendous challenges during my lifetime, as I am quite sure that most people have to one degree or another. But isn't it wonderful that we're given that opportunity to, as I might say, sometimes wrestle with ourselves so that we come to that, you know, to that unity or wholeness, as I might put it, when we are able to, by grace and, you know, by the help of the divine, both without in the form of our friends and the world in which we live, and also within ourselves and the commitment that we have to make as individuals to whatever degree of endeavor and effort that we are willing to put into it. But I find, yes, there is light, there is darkness, there is life, there is death. And even in it all, I think to myself, what a glorious and wonderful thing it is to have awoken this morning once again to this glorious and wonderful world and life that we experience. Very sad for many, many people. And yet, even in that, I think it is so wonderful within that we can find within that which transcends all of our pains and difficulties and sufferings. And I'd like to thank you, Alison, not for me to ramble on, as it were, but I'd like to thank you for your invitation to attend your great event this afternoon. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Raymond. And I saw your comment about light and dark and the challenge that is uniting light and darkness, and that theme comes out in both books. And apparently Goethe's last words were "more light," something like that. That's what Ian says. You know, give me more light. Which I think is really interesting. And
I think, Alison, if I may just add this, I think, you know, I think there's a peace. You know, we have the duality of peace and disturbance. But then I think to myself, I've recently been thinking this, what about the peace that doesn't belong to the duality?
I have to think about that one.
Yeah, me too.
Well, one of the things I was going to say was that I am finishing the book now, and the section, one of the sections I need to make a decision about is what I do with the word hope. So one of the readers of the manuscript said, you know, you probably need to say something about hope. And I realized I was finding this really hard, that I'm trying to do the uniting, that in a way write a book that is about prisons, that doesn't avoid the violence that is both created and imminent there, and yet still, as Todd said, come out with a very confident grasp of what humanity looks like and how we should trust in it. And I'm finding it hard to come down on one side or the other. I'm struggling with the word hope. And I go back to Gillian Rose. She, in one of her books, I think Love's Work, she uses a phrase, it's someone else's phrase, and it's keep your mind in hell and despair not, or something. That's sort of, is that hope? Is how do we, there's so much in the prison world, there's so much false hope, and people trying to deny the reality and talk about release, for example, or what you're like on release in ways that just strike me as the Pandora's jar version of hope. It's actually quite a damaging thing. So somehow this is all related, how we unite light and darkness and yet still see the light and grasp hope. And I'm still working with that thought.
Well, I'm looking very much looking forward to purchasing your book when it comes out.
Thank you, Raymond. Thank you for coming in.
Thank you, Elena.
Raymond Harrison, will you come in and join us?
Sure. Thank you for your presentation and for getting me to read the book in the last week. I had read the Safranski book several years ago, and they are quite different. I too had some moments of revulsion when you hear that Goethe is a womanizer, so to speak, and then as privy councillor, he's also in charge of overseeing the execution of women who have killed their illegitimate children. It's just mind-boggling. But the thing I got out of reading this book is that Goethe was able to accept in some strange way the two parts of his self, which we always want to go towards the moral side. He did too. I think that's what more light means. But he accepted both. So I'll go back to the famous quote, which I think of all the time. I'm a writer of poetry. Two souls, alas, are housed within my breast, and each will wrestle for the mastery there. At the end of this book, I still have 14 pages to go, but at the end of this book, I feel like for Goethe, the wrestling match goes on. At some points in his life, one of the wrestlers is on top. At another point, it switches over. He doesn't deny that part of himself. He accepts everything. He doesn't try to suppress everything. So I just want to bring up two quotes, one from the Safranski book, which was very meaningful to me, where he's talking about Shakespeare's theater. And Safranski quotes, his plays all revolve around that hidden point. We talked about the point before, where the uniqueness of ourself, our supposed free will, collides with the necessary course of the world. Okay. And then in Wilson's book, what I read this morning, despite his idolatrous love of Sophocles and Shakespeare, Goethe had no tragic sense. And it made me think of Hamlet, which is one of my favorite stories. And in Hamlet, you have a person who's around 30 years old, off in Germany studying philosophy and writing plays, clearly has the talent to be a playwright. But when his father dies and is murdered, he has to come home and avenge his death. And he turns from playwright Hamlet into Prince Hamlet. And that change actually leads to his death. So it seems to me that Goethe is always wrestling with himself, that there's this wrestle between what I would call psychologically the self and the ego. And, Wilson calls him an egomaniac at times. He had a very strong ego, but in the individuation of life, it seems that, and this goes back to the work of Ian McGilchrist, that The Master and His Emissary, where the egoic or left brain side tries to take over and master the more holistic self. And it seems as if in Goethe, both are held in kind of like a dance or a balance or a wrestling match. You go back and forth. And as difficult as it was for me to accept at the beginning, the negative parts, the disturbing parts, I was ready to turn away from the book after 100 pages. When I got to the end, I just think it's incredible that he was able to hold his two selves together. And of course, I liked Wilson when he was talking about his contemporary issues, because we have a very small group of friends, but two of our close friends, their 30-year-old children, one male, one female, committed suicide in the last 5 years. And when I read his statistic about 47,000 Americans committing suicide, suicide to me seems to be that act of that one part of the self, rather than the outside world having something to do with it. It's almost like it's the one part of the self fighting against the other side, trying to destroy or eliminate the other side. So I'm rambling on more than the first Raymond, but the book really moved me, and there's so much there. Thank you.
Yeah, I completely agree, and thank you for your responses. One of the things I didn't say, because a lot of my work has been on suicides and suicide attempts in prison, that another term I've come to use is mute versus resonant. That one of the things that prisoners, and that this may be specific to the prison environment, but I don't know, one of the things that they've often said when the kind of mind opts for death is, they don't use this language, but it's what they describe. It's when the wire to the world stops vibrating, and that's about connectedness and either our relations and being seen and regarded as human, which inevitably being regarded as human must mean being regarded as someone with potential who can grow. And I've also been switched on to Ian McGilchrist. It's inevitable, because one of the reasons why I now see a very direct line between the work I've done in prisons and the world we're creating outside is his argument that we need to live in a resonant world, and that we're not creating one, we're creating an I-it universe. But actually the human spirit doesn't do very well in a mute I-it environment. And so in some ways, I'm now seeing the work I've done in prisons as a kind of concentrated way of thinking really hard about what human beings need. And because in prison, you see the dynamics, they're intensified. Prisoners become very philosophical and aware of what matters to them because of their circumstances. But actually, this is very much true of our more general condition, which is why I think for the first time, I kind of see this work as taking me out of prisons and thinking much harder about what the implications are of this account for the way we live.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Can I come in? It's Jean. I apologize, I can't put my camera. Can you hear me? Should I go ahead? Thank you. Thank you for your extraordinary presentation. And I've heard you speak again before at the Pari Center, and your work is so important. I went to a 2-day congress in Paris this last weekend, and one of the panels was devoted to Goethe and his work on Werther and suicide. And these were Lacanian psychoanalysts, and I thought it was important to your thinking to add this, that they looked at idealism and sublimation. And they were saying the character Werther was autobiographical. He falls in love with Charlotta, and he's suicidal. And with a small delay, he writes the book instead. He writes it in one sitting. And it's the beginning of the Romantic movement, and lots of suicides follow the book. But he meant it to be a satire. This is what the analysts were saying. And the whole thing was they were positing that it was his ability to sublimate, to actually write the book, allowed him to unwork the idealism that is very linked with suicide. So these Lacanian psychoanalysts think that having these unrealistic ideals often causes this moral wound, a feeling that there's no place, there's no resonance, as you put it. So I have two very good friends who both suicided during lockdown. And it's interesting because one of them painted one of the most important portraits of Gillian Rose and was a very close friend of Jacqueline, Gillian, and their mother. And the painting was sort of kept in Gillian's mother's house after I knew her very well with Rowan Williams. It's part of my youth as well. And the writing of Love's work, and I knew her very well during her cancer and dying process. So this was an extraordinary artist who was a bank robber, went to prison, served 14 years, went to the Slade, managed to get into this famous art school, and he was released from prison. He was a wonderful artist, but over lockdown, this is, for 40 years after prison, he takes his life. And then there's the great Bernard Stiegler, this amazing French philosopher who robbed banks, went to prison, discovered himself in prison, is released from prison because of what philosophers do to get him out. He goes on and has this extraordinary life as a philosopher, but over lockdown kills himself. So it's just, I suppose my question to you is, because I think your work is so important, is why it is that the wound continues, and you get Primo Levi after the camps, after a long period, that you get the trauma. There's something that sort of revisits so long after, when you think through sublimation, through transformation, through resonating, through finding a place in the world, that they would be, you get my question. I don't even know how to pose it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jean. I mean, that was amazing. I could listen to a lot more of what you were saying, and there's clearly you're very connected into this world that I'm reading about and studying, and there are, because I've studied this subject for such a long time, I've kind of collected examples of people who have, like Primo Levi and all these others who've written or painted and then take their own lives, and they belong to a very large club of sensitive, artistic, intelligent writers or so on, but who find life too much, and as you said, can't recover from wounds inflicted, and it feels like it just that in itself is a really important topic. And one of the things I've written this book very differently to how I've written my others. It is more personal and vivid, and I say at the start, I mean, this is in a way my link with Goethe and his delicate empiricism is partly a kind of protest about wooden science, and me trying to say this is a human world and I'm studying it as a human being, and lives end and hearts break in this book. And there are many examples of prisoners who I've got to know really well, supported, understood. They come out, and one I'm thinking of was found dead on a beach a few years after his release, and yet somehow in prison he was, able to find friends, play music, all sorts of things. And so I guess for people to kind of stay alive, they have to find support. That's the irony of what I see in what I call exceptional prisons, is that prisoners often really value the sense of community they build together. But I fear for them leaving prison, where all the barriers come straight back up. There are laws against people staying in touch with other ex-prisoners when they come out of prison. And so some of the things that they learn about life and their own needs and values whilst they're serving prison sentences are actually impossible to achieve when they leave. And so a bit like some of my kind of theoretical ideas applied in practice outside, I feel like quite a lot of what I see in good prisons are things that really should be built outside. They're things that are needed outside at least as much, if not more, than they are needed in prison. So Thank you very much for your contribution there, and perhaps we'll talk again at some stage.
Great. Thanks so much, Jean. I have a question if nobody else is. So for me, it's interesting, the autobiographical that you've mentioned with Goethe and Faust, perhaps, and then the talk about there are these two sides of him. Especially for me, I came to Goethe through more of like an alchemical route and this idea of transformation. So there's also this idea that without lead, you can't make gold. So if you ignore the heavy stuff, right? Let's call it the heavy stuff. Then that most people want to just kind of throw out the window and get rid of, then you have no matrix to grow the seed and to transform yourself in a certain sense. And that's, to me, is really fascinating. And especially with what you're saying about prisons, almost being like an alchemical vessel for transformation in a metaphoric sense, if not a very real sense. So I'm kind of curious about your thoughts on that, or to expound, if that, you're smiling, so that I might be hitting something good here.
Yes, yeah, you are. You're making me think all sorts of things. And I like that, the way you put it, as prison as an alchemical vehicle for transformation. And I suppose one of the things I do in my introductory chapter is give examples of, again, people, often writers, who've been to prison, suffered. So, for example, Dostoevsky, he's an obvious example. One of the things he writes about, I think it's in Notes from Underground, is how when he was in prison, he lost his faith in humanity. He saw degradation and horrors. But it was the moment when someone was kind to him. So somebody did a kind gesture. And that became his faith in life and in human values. And that was sort of what I've seen that and talked about it with prisoners and sort of measured it. So it's when we're in places of deep suffering, but we experience kindness or connectedness, that we realize the power and significance of that humanity. It's sort of, I think, who was it? Was it Hegel who said the owl of Minerva flies at dusk? What you're saying, which is that it's when we need the darkness. Maybe we need the darkness is not the right way to say it, perhaps, but that in the darkness, that we often see or understand the significance of the light. And so, again, I've tried to add quite a fine line. I don't want to say that suffering is a good thing, and that gratuitous suffering certainly isn't, but that there are times when the human spirit can find its way through suffering. And I think, as perhaps Jean was saying before, not always, that it's a delicate art, but that there's definitely a relationship between the lead and the light, as you put it. But we need more light. I mean, even Goethe said that we need the ratio of light to lead to be above a certain.
Because of something one of my friends who's Buddhist mentioned years ago, and that was, he said, because I was discouraged, right? I was really discouraged. I was in Boston, in this big city, and I wasn't necessarily connecting a whole lot with a lot of people. And he's like, well, when it's dark, it's easier to see the light. When it's light out, when the sun's out, it kind of blinds us in a certain sense. But then at the nighttime, then you see the candles that are lit, was kind of what he was getting at. And he really grounded with that. And to me, that was fascinating.
I've actually also used Nick Cave. I don't know how many of you are Nick Cave fans, but I'm a mad keen Nick Cave fan. And
I remember you mentioned Nick Cave before.
He has written this book. It's called Faith, Hope and Carnage. And he talks about the relationship between grief and meaning. And he explains it better than anyone I know, but it's the same story. It's a bit like, was it who was it who said, was it Leonard Cohen, the crack is where the light gets in, or something like that? That we have these these analogies for a reason, that the world will never be, just as nature will never be all goodness and light, that there is violence and challenge in it always, but that for humans, finding a way of making suffering connect us to what really matters and what we need is often our way through. And what happens in prisons, I was going to say this earlier when was it Raymond talked that I'm working now with someone who's spent time in prison but who's now outside and has become a kind of campaigner for restorative justice. And he's amazing. He's learned so much about himself, but also about the world. And one of the things he's learned to help him on his way is the phrase, "Which wolf are you feeding?" And like Goethe and his struggling soul, he's now aware that he has two souls, but he's feeding one of them. And that one becomes the dominant one. So the one he pays attention, the one he responds to, is the one that then kind of takes over his spirit. And when he learned that, he made a much more conscious effort to feed the other one. And he's really, it's just a very helpful way of communicating some of these dynamics. And that's, if there's transformation in prison, it tends to be in that kind of territory. People being able to accept and work with their dual-souled nature, but feed the better side of their nature, having learned some of the consequences of feeding the other one. I hope that makes sense.
Do you have any more finishing remarks or anything, or like, do you know when your book's coming out? I know authors hate to be asked that if they're midstream.
Yeah,
but do you have any closing
remarks, or just that for me it's new. It's very new to be talking outside my field and to this audience, this kind of audience of human beings who are generally interested in the way we live. And for me, this is part of my journey. I wanted this book to lead me somewhere. You said you were discouraged. I was definitely discouraged by what I was seeing happening in prisons, that they've just got worse and harder. We've made them quite damaging, and just the sort of the politics of punishment and so on made me wonder whether I could continue to do this kind of work. And so part of my applying for this Leverhulme Fellowship was to have an opportunity to stand back. It's why I so identify with Goethe when he was administering Weimar, and he was really frustrated because he couldn't think or write or read. And I was in that state, but overwhelmed by what I was finding in prisons. And I needed some time to step back and to read and gather my thoughts and just analyze my data in a way that was burning to be done, but I hadn't had time to do. And I think for me, it was a pilgrimage. That's what one of my friends has said. And so this book should be finished by the summer. It's taken me 4.5 years to put it together. I did go back to work full time, but it didn't work. I've now gone half time because I want to hold on to the thing I found while I've been writing the book, which is the light for me is in reading other people's work and connecting in atmospheres like this. And so I'm still sort of searching, but my aim in writing the book was to go on a journey of some sort that connects me back to life and to live the I thou rather than I it world somehow. So that's what it's about for me, and it's why, in a way, finding Pari and people who come to these sorts of sessions has been a really important part of that journey, which is ongoing.
Great. Well, thank you so much for sharing. This has been fantastic, and pulling in the old and the new, right? Like the Goethe and his experiences and justice, and then pulling in modern attempts at justice as well in the prison system. So thank you very much. Thank you tell our participants we're going to close out in the next minute or so. Final announcements. We have another installation of Future World on Wednesday with Rebecca Tarnas and Alex Gomez-Marin. So if you would like to sign up for that, the link is available on our website. And then we also have our in-person 25th anniversary this coming weekend. And we have our 2 more in-person events coming up in June as well, Consciousness and Gentle Action. So we hope to see you all here at the Pari Center. And thank you all for your questions.